Record, and we're on the air. Welcome to the inaugural video of Brain Pick with Nick and Vic. I'm Vic.
I'm Nick.
Today's subject is shoulder program or arm care, depending on what confusing way you want to put it. Do you want to hop off and give us a definition of what you would say to a player if they're new to the organization? They say, what is arm care?
Yeah, I would say overall, I mean, this is a topic that I'm sure we're going to discuss shortly, but I'll say overall arm care is just the well-being of you, the athlete. And so how can I help, and how can our, just from a umbrella standpoint, the strength conditioning, psych, sports science, like everything that we can incorporate, basically how do we help you stay on the field and be able to express your athleticism on the field day in and day out without, mitigating injury risk, I would say. So overall, I'll say arm care is just well-being of the athlete, well-being of you, the person, in order to sustain the stresses of an entire season over 140 games, depending where you're at.
So being that the times are a little weird now, but you still get to treat some guys, what would you say the last time you did arm care, what did that entail with a given player?
Yeah, I'm trying to think now because my role is way different. So my version of arm care is just seeing what the person has, like what their low-hanging fruit is. So they come in, they have, for instance, I did evaluate a guy who had right shoulder, what felt like to him as like bicep tendonitis. And on evaluation, the dude basically had no external rotation. I mean, it's quarantine. He's been out of shape, so he hasn't really worked out, hasn't thrown, has no capacity there. And so for me, the biggest thing was clearing up some of that range of motion. And so my arm care started with just gaining some of the external rotation back and making it less sticky, if you want to classify it as that, but just to feel more smooth going into end range. And so just describing to him was basically needing the requisite motion in order to perform the activity. And he didn't have that. He was basically stressing end ranges without any strength, any stability, any proprioception there. I mean, that's a guess. I don't know how to per se test that and quantify it, but you can kind of figure a guy who hasn't been working out much for a month and a half, 2 months, and maybe gaining another 15, 20 pounds on top of barely throwing is probably going to have some issues when you try and ramp up and get off the mound. So our exercise was just gaining the external rotation back.
Yeah, kind of the tough part is we do make these claims about talking about stability or proprioception or strength at those given ranges, and really I think it comes to be a little tough to evaluate that without just looking at purely can they get to that range, and then they exhibit some sort of good force behind it, which again is somewhat subjective on our end. It's like, what do we have to compare that to?
Exactly. Let me ask you this, jumping off of that topic. We had a conversation as a staff, just going over stuff in general. And I'm not sure if it's FMS that talks about mobility versus stability or whatnot, but basically I asked the question, how do you know if someone needs more mobility or more stability in a specified joint? And the answer was joint play, essentially, like taking the joint and playing around with it. So under X amount of torque or pressure or whatever I can place stressed on that joint, do you think that's enough to actually tell, like doing an anterior drawer, if I can grab the humeral head is actually testing for laxity? And I guess like in a static position as opposed to a dynamic pitching where probably going to be magnified and the forces are going to be way more than I can actually test.
I think it gives you a little bit of an indication of what that joint looks like. Like there are those passive structures that are important to see. Is that capsule lax, or in case I think, or in my opinion, I think that you could probably make a solid argument to say that there is some laxity in there. Now, whether or not that's an issue or whether or not that's the reason for their success, I think that's a totally different animal. And when we're talking about us as clinicians trying to restore some stability, I think that's a super tough thing to really say that we accomplished. I think it's one of those things where we encourage it or promote it. And whether or not you got the desired outcome, I don't know, honestly, because again, we're talking about on the table, what do we see versus when they go out and pitch. I think that's a totally different thing because you're just isolating the joint when you have them lay on the table. But I don't think that you're going to
Feedback,
lose.
right?
Hmm?
Like they're getting feedback, like you're coaching them through it. You're, hey, stabilize here, do this, whatever. They don't, like, that's completely different on the mound or completely different when they're out on the field.
Yeah, there's not going to be a direct translation to where even if you say, okay, stand on this balance pad, and then they go out and stand on the mound, like, wow, this is way easier to stand on the mound versus that balance pad.
Stable now?
It's not that black and white. But
Mhm.
as long as you're paying attention to what you're providing them, and then if you're thinking about joint integrity as a whole, it's like, are you addressing the different planes, the different muscle groups that you want to incorporate? And again, thinking, what do they do on a daily basis? They're going to use a lot of their cuff and big movers as well, and that's fine. I want them to use those, but at the same time, I think there's the balance component of hit the muscles that maybe aren't used, especially in isolation, but the muscles that aren't used a ton. And so you think of functional movement, which that's a different conversation. But if you look at like serratus slides, I don't know if that's a functional movement, but I think it's a good position for the scap to appreciate on the ribs. And they don't ever look like that position when they're pitching. That's okay. It's still just having them recruit those muscle groups in maybe a more isolated fashion.
Who is it that there's a book that talks about basically the transfer of training. So I don't know if it's all, it's not like, it's not Bernstein, it's somebody else. I don't know why I can't think of it, but basically talk about like what does some, I know Bosch does a little bit of this, but like what does something need to transfer to sport? And so I guess there's a criteria. But at the end of the day, for instance, like you squats, you could classify squats as functional because you are building a baseline strength and you can use power, you can force velocity, like you can build a lot of things on that spectrum. But it is hard to say, like, okay, does this directly correlate? Does a sagittal plane squat directly correlate to, pitching? There's like the one Cressy article that talks about like lateral jumps correlating with pitching velocity, but yeah, it's hard. I mean, I agree. I think the serratus slide teaches you to get into like a flexed thorax position and to abduct the scap a little more and to use some serratus. So it's good exercise. It's good movement as long as it's a progressed and regressed.
I would say the most functional movement you can have is the actual movement that they need to do to perform. So performance, you know, and I think that's kind of like the weighted balls, the driveline program. I mean, that's again pretty close to what they're actually going to be doing. It's not the exact same thing, but it's pretty darn close, especially when you compare that to having them do ISTs, Ys, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just appreciate different components of what we do as clinicians. It doesn't all have to be in one basket of, hey, this doesn't look functional, so it's useless. It's never like that.
No. Do you think we need to throw more as a population?
Like in our baseball population?
So, for instance, capping people at, oh, you've gone, 25 throws here, 25 throws here, 15 throws there, good to go. Do you think a lot of the injuries that are occurring is because we just don't have the capacity for throwing? Like, yes, we throw all the time, but maybe we just need a larger capacity. And so people who throw for 30 minutes, for instance, that'll fatigue a lot of people. But if you worked up to that, maybe now in, June, July, August, if it were a normal season, maybe you wouldn't be dwindling off as much if you had built up that capacity and maintained it.
Yeah, it goes again back to everything in a balance to where they should have those days where they have super high volume, if they're going long toss or whatever it's going to be, where they can balance out those heavy days with days where give yourself a blow. Like you can't do that every single day. It's just like any other component of training. It's like there has to be recovery days, but yeah, it's definitely important to build up those high volume days so that they can get through the longevity of a season. But
Yeah.
of a return to play for like a pitcher for that kind of progression, I'd say that's when you should really be paying attention to what the volume is of how many throws, and that should matter. It shouldn't just be an arbitrary number where we just throw out 15 today and then 20 tomorrow. It's like, why do you want to do that? And is it going to actually transfer to where, okay, we had you build up this much throws, and now we're saying, okay, we'll throw you back into your regular practice, and then boom, they're going like 2 or 3 times the amount of volume that we had them on paper. So you really have to have your finger on the pulse for what their demand is.
Yeah, it's super important to understand the workload there, and not, like you said, have a okay, they touch the mound, we throw out to 120, okay, we're good to hit the mound and progress to a live and 2 more, and then good to go. Like it's a large increase. Those are goes back to like organism, environment, task. Like basically, you keep changing the environment, there's going to be different stress, so you have to account for all that every stage. Then maybe even adding people to watch, like more people to watch the bullpen. Like that could be another stress for the guy. And it's the same amount of throws that he's had before, but maybe he responds differently to that now.
And we were talking a little bit about, are we putting guys on the mound soon enough, or do you think it's maybe a good idea to get guys to even play like light catch with the catcher standing up, where they're on that elevated mound or on that decline? Do you think it's more important to get that incorporated earlier on in a throwing program, even if they're not going to be throwing a bullpen for the next week or so, let's say? It's like, is there really that much risk in having them get familiarity with, okay, this is what the mound feels like, and getting some context for what my end goal is, instead of a flat ground, which is, again, not functional or commonly seen?
Yeah, I just thinking about that now, I could see just maybe having him go on the mound and doing dry work, towel drills, visualization type stuff, feeling the mound, maybe not actually throwing the ball, but at least getting on the surface and feeling it prior to the mound. I think more people are starting to lean towards just get off the mound anyway instead of a flat ground, because a mound can facilitate arm mechanics instead of we don't pitch on the ground, so it's just like now you're practicing another aspect of the sport that isn't really part of the sport. You're always pitching on an elevated surface. So yeah, I would say that's one thing that's changed for me recently is, well, 2 things, is starting to think about like volume of throwing and time of throwing, so longer, but also getting onto the mound and doing a short box. Like, and that maybe that's my starting position, is just bring the catcher in 15, in front of the plate, and that's where they start their mound progression, as opposed to flat grounds now. So not having 1 or 2 flat grounds and going off to the mound, like just going right to the mound kind of first. That can facilitate, as long as you're with the pitching coach, and it can help you out a bit with the mechanic side. But I think I'm leaning more towards that as of the past like 7 months, I'd say.
Yeah. And what about other precursors for putting things in between? Okay, we went from doing all rehab stuff, no throwing, to, all right, we're going to throw you out there, play catch to 60 feet. And then, like, how do you, like, mix things in the middle to where they're getting a smooth transition? And again, like you said, with task, environment, and organism, where you're incorporating and isolating different variables instead of getting lost. And I forgot the different things that changed around this day.
Yeah, and I think that's, I took it for granted before, and on a position now where I'm looking at that a little more carefully and working with the PTs that are in the same organization as me now, and kind of having a blend phase. And so basically, like using plyometric, using plyo balls, using whatever else, but basically having like a ramp in phase where once they start their, okay, I'm going to return. Basically, it's a return to throwing. And so when you return to throwing, now we incorporate plyo balls. So whether that's, you can look at any of like the driveline stuff and some of the other research articles, but basically using a heavier ball to start with, that is the longer impulse essentially, and so not as much stress as acutely as using a light ball. And so you can use that to start, where you're doing, start with reverse throws, syncing up lower half mechanics, plows into the wall, and then you can start like the normal like dribbles against the wall or the rebounder that we've always done, but then going into and syncing up the lower half, whether it be roll-ins, rock-ins, pivot picks, like all those exercises that were coined by um, Driveline and all them, but there definitely is some merit to all those, and dosed appropriately, I think they're definitely very good at bridging the gap in between rehab and throwing, or rehab and actually the process of throwing a ball.
Yeah. How about when we kind of go back to arm care? I guess my initial impression or thought of what we would discuss is the classic, light 3-pound dumbbells, our assisted tubing, and then manuals. What's your take on that? For what's your intent and what are you
Yeah,
trying to do with that?
I'll give you my take if you give me yours. I would say a couple things first, and so basically we use as an athlete trainer before, I only carried 3, 4, and 5 pound dumbbells essentially in the travel trunk. And who's to say, like we do a squat, we have 1 rep maxes, we understand where we're at on the spectrum of strength, but we do dumbbells and say 3 by 10, 3 by 15, 3 by 12, whatever. How do we know we're actually getting strengthening? And that's even before I discuss other aspects of those exercises. I would just say like we don't like, it's hard to test a 1 rep max for a Y or a T or whatever it might be. And so on the grand scheme of things, maybe we're just working endurance. Maybe we're, like I don't know what on the spectrum we're working. That's the 415. So that's also like my first bone to pick is how do we know we're appropriately dosing the right amount of stress to the body? It's not like we can say, like our squat was 400, so we'll work backwards and we'll work at 385 today for 3 reps. Like we can't really program that out unless we actually, test people's scaption exercises and T's and Y's and all that stuff. So that's my first part. But then secondly, for people that have restricted external rotation, or they can't smoothly get into external rotation, or they lack end range shoulder flexion, or they lack cervical rotation to that side, whichever side, I's, T's, and Y's are probably the last thing I want to do for those people. Because in order to get in those positions, whether it's cervical rotation, flexion, ER, you need to be able to expand in the back of the thorax. Basically, they call it the upper dorsal rostral, but I guess upper posterior mediastinum, whatever lingo you want to use for it, but basically in between the scaps. And those exercises are designed for that area. And if you can't expand there and you just keep further compressing it, you're basically just putting someone in a pattern where now they're learning to not be able to get into these end range motions. So you're basically hammering them home further in the aberrant pattern. And so for somebody who can expand and get in those positions and has awesome motion, then yeah, by all means, that's the population for the throwers 10 or for the I's, T's, Y's, like by all means, go for it. But you basically have to, like FRC people type say is you have to earn the right, like show me you've earned the right to do this exercise. And I think I's, T's, and Y's are bad for a decent amount of our population, just having worked with them and knowing what their motion feels like, what, their movement capabilities are in the upper body. So it's definitely got me thinking I'd say this year on those exercises at least. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's still fresh in my mind on that second part you talked about. I think that all pitchers or really any athlete should be able to go into an IY and T and without having to put themselves at any sort of risk of reinforcing their pattern. I think it's just a normal scapulohumeral motion. And so if you position them, I think it's kind of up to the clinician to position them to where they can achieve that without compensation or without getting their upper traps or undesirable chains involved. So I think there is a place for it, absolutely. And when it comes to strength-wise, I don't know that it's, to me, I don't know that it's something that we're looking at from a programming standpoint or trying to get them stronger. I think it's almost like an active recovery. So if you look at someone who, if you're doing maybe a cross training type thing where if they have a long low intensity bike ride where it's basically like a flush, or if a guy runs poles after his pitching day, it's more of a flush, right? So it's not something to where, hey, we want to get them better. I don't know if it's not the main focus, isn't always we want to get them better with their endurance. It's almost like you want to get some of the hormone slash chemical, I don't want to say waste, but some of the chemical byproducts kind of flowing through in the most natural state versus throwing on a Mark Pro, like get them to use their actual body and circulatory system to return some of that and again achieve some better recovery. So I look at it as just enough load to where they can recruit those muscles that are not primary movers or big movers, lat, pec. That's not the main target for the shoulder program that I think of. I think it's more of the smaller muscles that have a huge role, but you also want to get those guys to kind of get activated and return some of that blood flow. But in the short of it, if I was going to talk to a player, I would basically be talking to them about shoulder program being we want to maximize recovery while using as many of your body's systems and methods of recovery as possible. So if we're looking physiologically, biomechanically, compensationally, if you're talking about the patterns like you're talking about, with what position the rib cage is in. So we're trying to restore some more neutral positions or get them to investigate the other end of the spectrum to where, hey, you're here, you just had a big outing. That's the most intense you can get. And this is sleeping. It's like, rest and digest, fight or flight. We want to get them from, hey, I'm right here right now as a pitcher. I want to get them a little bit closer to that rest and digest, just so they can put themselves in a good position to recover.
There we go. Yeah, definitely agree. So for instance, it depends on your goal, right? Like it depends. Like why am I using this exercise? And so it could be like a plethora of reasons, whether you want to use it, like you said, scapular retraining, using it as blood flow, using it as, like a bicyclist does or like a runner does. They do a cool down lap or they do a whatever. And I know the reason we do a lot of that stuff here with my team is based off of like stroke research. I think that's, it's good at increasing, like we talked about, using multiple systems. So using circulatory system, using hormones, using all that to basically recover. And so it's definitely, it depends. And that's the thing, is you can make a case for almost any exercise at any time, depending on what your goal is and how you use it. But I do agree where where would you start then? So obviously day one, they pitch. In a perfect world, if you had complete control and you did everything, it was your project, guy pitched today, what does he do when he comes out, and kind of what does the 5-day routine look like in your mind?
I would use that high intensity day of, hey, I just came off the mound to one of the more intense shoulder programs. So manuals where I can dictate if I want to give them a little bit more resistance. And that's also going to give me some feedback of how gassed are you. Again, it's a subjective measure, but I'm looking to see, hey, do you have a lot left in the tank? Or are you totally gassed from that? And that can give you a little bit of insight of their status of, are they in good shape or I don't know. Are they in good shape? Are they showing a lot of exhaustion during that motion? But I would hit it manuals primarily. That's not an always type thing, but if I can, I'd try and get my hands on them and gauge some of their fatigue. And then as the days go on during this 5-day rotation, the next day, gauge his soreness. Where is he sore? And like you say, where depends on your goal. I think in the first place, you have to have a goal for it to mean anything. If you just say it depends on your goal and then you're just going at something arbitrarily, that's not really a goal. That's just blindly walking around. So I would just pick something out, and I'm fully prepared to be wrong about it. But I would say he'll like, let's see if we can. If you talk about posterior mediastinum expansion, let's explore it, try and open it up, see if we get any sort of change from a table test. And that's not your only means, but you kind of use that as a working theory, and try and drive that home a little bit from day to day, and see if they have any changes with where am I sore. Maybe I'm less sore in my bicep area. Does that have to do with what we did? I don't know. I don't know that you're ever going to get that answer, but if it's kind of working well, then you continue with it and see if you can get a more permanent or less transient change. And if they kind of go back to, okay, I'm sore again here, you don't necessarily have to throw it out, but then you kind of change your approach to something new. It's like it's a working continuum of I'm changing my theories, but I have theories nonetheless. But then they're going to come off the mound with a bullpen, either day 2, day 3, depending on what their thing is, and that's when I'd hit more tubing or dumbbells typically. Again, as it's a higher stress day, let's keep that high stress day to where we're introducing those variables of, like, I'm going to use rest days as a rest day, so we'll do more low intensity, like not a ton of resistance, but maybe some more positional stuff on those days you're not coming off the mound, just to get full advantage of that. Like if you're training even on your own, like as a non-athlete, but you want those off days where it's like, hey, I just need a breath, like I need a blow, I need to take a little bit of time, and then I'll be ready tomorrow to get a full workout. You don't go like every day I'm doing something. So by the time we get to that day 5, they're coming off the mound and they just kind of repeat it. So
Does the strength side do the lifts on those days as well, and then off days are off days from that aspect, or do they throw in, like, I mean, you're doing runs outside, you're doing so basically, like, is there still work 5 days a week then?
it'll vary from guy to guy, but I think a lot of times some guys will do a next day lift, which is, again, that's fine. I think from my standpoint, though, I would try and get those specific. If he's pitching, it's a largely shoulder, upper arm, upper extremity movement. Then I'm going to incorporate the shoulder program with that. And then as far as the lift goes, that if he does it the next day, that's fine. But I'm going to try and encourage the volume to be on the same day as far as I go. I'm not trying to say what the strength coach or performance coaches should do. That's just from my standpoint of when I feel like the shoulder program specifically would fit into that. I think that same day. And again, it's pushing them into that rest and digest. So a lift isn't necessarily a rest and digest activity, right? But I would argue shoulder program could be a little bit closer to that, because you're trying to transition them from, hey, they're fully amped up, they're in game mode, to, okay, we're going to do lower resistance, lower threshold type movements to get them into that rest and digest position so that they can come back tomorrow better recovered, and then they can knock out their lift.
Yeah, definitely agree. I mean, hormonally, I feel it'd be cool to do it right after a lift, or sorry, right after an outing. Like get a full body in that day. Well, everything's gonna be a full body, but get in full day, like maybe heavier on the leg side or whatever it might be, and then the next day same thing, can be like a movement prep, can be try and restore any range of motion that was lost, and then basically just progress to, that the next mound day would be, I'm assuming you'd be in agreement, like would be their strength day, would be their heavier day in the weight room. What about, so what you showed me is there's some stuff on the fourth day prior to the start. Is that anything that you would do as an athletic trainer with the guys, or is that just referring to their weight room activities?
You said on the 4th day or on start?
The fourth day prior to the start. Is there anything specific, or is it just like the sprinting that's maybe low volume but super high intensity or higher intensity?
We're saying sprinting as far as conditioning.
Just any in general. Like I know on the fourth day it said basically prime them to get ready for the fifth day. And so I guess what does that priming come from?
I think it's individualized. Whatever's going to put them in their best, most comfortable position to go out and perform the next day. If they like to have a little bit more of an intense thing to where they kind of get amped up, go for it. From my point of view in the training room, I'm going to try and again just drive home some of the same concepts of if it's some positional exercises. I don't think I have to get too fancy, but once it comes time to start day, it's kind of whatever they can get amped up to do, because by then they should be ready to go. It shouldn't be like they're relying on us to necessarily be ready for that start. It's a compliment, but I think you have to just stick with your original plan and keep it flowing. But what are your thoughts as far as that day 4?
So just I know Joel Jameson talks a lot about basically preparing the body for the next day. So having like whether it's small volume, short lifts, whatever it might be, but something that's taxing to a degree, but not going to fatigue you. And so that's basically acts as a primer for the next day. So like if you were going to lift on, lift on Tuesday, that was going to be your heavy strength day. You would do a light, low to medium intensity on Monday to prepare you for that heavy day on Tuesday. And so I've talked to someone before about they like to do stability type exercises on that day prior to. And so whether it's body blade, taps, anything that you could want to use to stabilize, quote unquote, stabilize somebody. But I do think some sort of exercise. I know they sprint on that day usually, just outside, get a couple like 30s in most likely. But I do think doing some sort of exercise that day could be beneficial for the following day, just as a like CNS primer, essentially.
I think that's fair. Again, I would kind of go back to what are your indicators for this is working well for them and this is helping performance. It's never going to be that clear cut to where, okay, we pinpointed this is the reason why they're having that success or this is the reason why they're not having that success. But if you're following like a physiological / biomechanical backbone, then I think it's reasonable.
Yeah, and sometimes, I haven't been in the business for 30 years, but I've heard people talk about, well, there's book science and there's, real world science. And sometimes it just doesn't work for people where they want the day off. But I also know some people who I'd be getting ready to go out to the game, it's 6:55 and they're inside shrugging 3:15, trying to get themselves all jacked up and getting ready. That's what works for them. And they go out and hit dingers. But, I'm sure it doesn't work for the wiry shortstop. Like that's more like the DH guy or wherever you're at, but it's all individualized. And so I guess you don't know unless it's subjective.
But what if he ends up hurting himself? Is that going to be the first thing that you go to say that's why?
Yeah.
And do you have any reasoning or evidence to say that is why? Yeah, I've been doing this my whole life. It's like, do we know that that's the straw or the straw that broke the camel's back? Or
no, but it's easy to blame, I guess, is the real answer. For instance, how many times like have you dealt with a guy had an issue? It was like, oh, he went golfing the night before. Oh, can't go golfing. We're fragile. And so it's easy to blame. And I know there are people out there who want to blame it. And I don't think everyone understands that we don't know why people get hurt. We don't understand why they get better. It's just how many things can we incorporate, and do our best guess. But overall, like it's just a low hanging fruit. You shrugged and pulled prior to getting out to the game, and you pulled a hamstring that game or whatever. You tore an oblique. I don't know. You don't know, but it's the best guess because it's something easy to blame.
But then again, there's times where I would put a lot of my money on it, saying, "Hey, this is probably that's a lot of the reasons why players aren't doing Olympic lifts in the gym it's like there probably is some correlation to that, and having some sort of injury related to, like, looking at how much volume they're having in season is just not really sustainable for them to go all out with some totally uncalled for movements in the weight room, or
Yeah.
they are doing sprints every single, like, there's consequences for everything they do. It's
Yeah.
just, when are you going to pinpoint, like, hey, this is something that the risk isn't worth the reward?
Yeah.
Because that's really what it's all about is, hey, like, there's probably have been guys that do Olympic lifts and they end up fine. It's like there are outliers, but at some point it comes down to, like, just, it's not worth the risk, right?
Agreed. Yeah, it's just not worth the risk, especially when it's not done. So I had a guy in my first year in full season who really liked Olympic lifting. His form was, it was okay. It wasn't great. It wasn't, it's what you would expect from a baseballer turn CrossFitter, turn whatever. But we told him he wasn't allowed to do that in the weight room if he wanted to do it. So I think he wound up just getting a membership somewhere else and doing it. But um, yeah, and I also, we dealt with a guy who biceps and triceps every day. That was his thing. And you know what? He was fine. He developed a shoulder injury. And so maybe he was tough or maybe he didn't talk about it, but for him, the reward was so much sweeter than the risk.
That's where the experience point comes in too. Like, been around long enough to where you've seen patterns of guys where, if you see guys doing that enough, there is going to be some correlation to where they might have some more issues. But again, it's not necessarily scientific, but that doesn't mean that you don't value it. Like, you still have to take into account what you've seen.
For instance, just to use this while we're on this topic, I did an internship, and the head athletic trainer at the time, Pace, telling me a story about this guy who had, what seemed to be blood at his elbow on the mound, and every pre-inning he goes into the dugout and he grabs his weighted ball and he throws it into the wall. He does like some plyo drills into the wall every inning. I don't know how long he was doing it for. I don't know if it was his thing for a couple of years or just he just started that year. But the first thing the athletic trainer did, he told me, was he grabbed it and threw it away. And it's kind of like, maybe that was could have been, but we really don't know. Like, he could have just his body could have been, most likely was building up something for past couple of years. And so, it's going to go whether or not he was doing that plyo ball in between innings anyway. But yeah, I guess like we talked about, it's perception of stuff that doesn't seem to be good for you at the time, and could be just due to lack of knowledge on the subject, but also it's easy to blame. It's easy to say that was the issue. You weren't doing anything else. You just did that, and now you blew out. So I'm going to say it's plyo ball.
And so, kind of getting back into when we're talking about exercise selection for shoulder program arm care, are there, and we want to individualize to the extent we can, yet at the same time we have these common movements, which is a good thing, because you could argue that a lot of these guys are living in the same pattern and moving through these same rhythms. So are there certain movements, exercises, positions that you think would be beneficial for baseball players on the whole to get into? And like, if you're going to rewrite or add to the shoulder program, anything that you think would be beneficial, just for the guys as a whole?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts on that, but I'll condense it. So I'm biased towards, again, fraternal angle. So if someone has a wide versus a narrow, I think they should be in different positions. And so there's some research behind basically supine breathing, side lying, and sitting, I believe, and it tells about like thorax diameter and how just in normal people how it expands. And so that basically, I wouldn't say proves, but it helps guide. So people who are wide would benefit from a supine or a side lying, because you can get some A to P expansion, whereas same thing with a narrow, but narrow would be good with quadruped, prone exercises that can help basically expand side to side instead of front to back. And so I'd be biased towards that. And like I've talked to someone before who just talked about being able to throw is basically just being able to reciprocity, being able to take one side of thorax and scap and twist, the other one basically retracts and comes back the other way. So it's basically how can you restore reciprocity? And so that could be a super long topic, and then one that I can't speak to as much, but I do think adding in some positions that we're normally in, and adding in some sort of stabilization or load capacity there as well, or um, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but even if it's just like half kneeling or standing or something where you're pulling a band in to act as like your driving arm, your glove side, and then you're doing something out with, whether you're in that T position, T or Y, whatever position you're in, but you're in that position doing something, whether you're holding, stabilizing, moving, whether you're doing something in that position. I still think making something a little more, hate to use the word, but I won't use the word, a little more sport specific, by standing up instead of being on the table. Um, and just knowing your physics and biomechanics and applying all the courses we've been to essentially is just using good training, good rehab, good movement skills. So if someone, like I talked about before, can expand back there, maybe I start with them with some exercises that will expand that, and then once I can have a little more expansion, then I progress to that. So it's hard to say, like, on the whole, like for everybody. I think everybody could benefit from maybe more throwing in general, like having a higher capacity and maybe better workload management, but also maybe a little more sport specific positions. And then you can get into nitty gritty and get down each person's rabbit hole and say this person needs, some, I won't even name exercises, but like can use this exercise, get into a better position, and then hammer home something after that, or restore movement capabilities.
A big part of that too is them having a finger on the pulse themselves. Like I think that's one of those things that I wish, or I think that players should start to embrace a little more, is transitioning from walking into the training room kind of deer in the headlights to where they ask, like, what do I have today? What should I be doing today? Where obviously we're not taking away our jobs, but if we can have them have some ownership or teach them some ownership to where we ask them, like, what are you feeling? Okay, based on what you're feeling, what has been beneficial for you? And if it's an emotion like you talked about or movement, they should have, and this maybe it's not realistic for everyone, but they should have an idea for, it usually feels like this. Now today I feel like I'm feeling it more here. And just having them create a little bit more of an inner dialogue so where they can help themselves, because if you look down the road, a lot of guys get somewhat more independent the older they get, and they kind of learn by then. But I think the sooner we can teach them to pay attention to what they're feeling, the more benefits they're going to have in the long run. Of like it's a working dialogue. Like it's not trainer tells me what to do, I do what the trainer says. So I think it has to be something along that.
We can definitely help push someone down the right path using, I mean, we're the quote unquote experts in the field. So like they're going to want our opinions on stuff. And maybe before we give it, like you said, hey, what has worked for you? What have you done in the past? I mean, my easiest treatments are when someone comes in and goes, hey, I just need cups after a start. I respond really well to that. Boom, cups. Like there's no ego involved. Like, oh no, I'll tell you what you need. You tell me cups are going to work. I'd be stupid not to use cups. And it's just one scenario, but the same thing is, what's felt good for you. I could give a guy 10 exercises. That's his routine. And, post rehab, now he's a full boy. And I go, hey, like, which ones did you like the most? And maybe those are the ones we just continue with. It's like, yeah, I really like the ones where you hold and do this or whatever it might be. But that would be like, I have a fast talk with our physical therapist, instead of athlete centered, it's more athlete driven. And so they're the ones performing. They're the ones going out at their bodies. They're the ones going out there. Like I want them to feel comfortable with what we're doing, that it's for them, but also what makes them feel the best in general. As opposed to an exercise I'm going to throw at them and hope that works because I got to change and, IR. Oh, this is your exercise kind of thing.
Yeah, to some degree, I think I've gotten a little bit spoiled the past year just because two trainers at one affiliate for more independent guys versus when you think back with rookie balls in particular, it's you with 40 guys, and the more self-sufficient you can get them to be, especially incorporating like elbow, myofascial stretch, or any movement-based items, I think that's going to be a huge win for you, just because you're saving your hands slash maybe you're getting more permanent changes versus the transient um, of some soft tissue work. Again, you're not saying soft tissue doesn't have its place, but if you can balance out that spectrum to where you get a huge wave in the training room, they're not just all waiting around holding their arm waiting for you to work on them hands on. So
That's the importance of those lower levels. After going through, you know, low A and GCL, basically like those your GCL, AZL, short season, and low A's are your positions where these kids figure out what they need, and as well as like I had to figure out my philosophy, my approach to communication, like a lot of things. Um, but it's definitely a position where you want, you know, it's a growth position for us as staff, but you also want growth for the players and understanding, hey, this is how you take care of your body, or these are things we can do. And now that we've taught you some things, maybe by the end of the year, the second half, you're starting to do a little more on their own.
yeah, feel that. So kind of based on when you first got into pro ball versus now, how's your opinion of arm care changed or shoulder program changed?
I think it's changed from college to my second year. I remember I changed. I worked with the team in grad school, and I changed the program from the first year to the second year because I learned some new things. And I was like, oh, I want to try some more anterior stability exercises out. And so like I would do a lot of like step ups and reach throughs, and I still think that's some pretty good stuff. Had its place. It's hard to get guys to do that in as a whole, because it seems more weight roomy ish than, you know, get on a table, do manuals, do bands or dumbbells. But I'd say it started with a whole bunch of just band and dumbbell routines to, hey, we just need this stronger, and as if, you know, hoping this is gonna get them stronger, I guess, without really testing it. To now I'm more concerned about certain ranges of motion. So now I'm more concerned about, for instance, like external rotation, or I'm not scared of GERD anymore. I'm just have an opinion of, well, this is, you know, an adaptation that we have, and how do we, on a spectrum, how do we manage both ends of it, as opposed to, you know, this guy has GERD, I need to stretch his posterior capsule and increase range of motion there. And I think now I look at it more as like a whole, more as what's his body type, what's his what does he respond to, I guess, and changing it. But it goes back to the same thing we had before, like how do you best reciprocity, like how do you get from one side to the other, and how do you make an exercise better for one person and know you're on the right path to at least making changes, as opposed to further putting them in a pattern or compensatory patterns you can't change.
What other pieces were you wanting to hit on as far as arm care goes?
Um, okay, so evaluation preseason, you are screening a guy, you know, you screen your entire team, 200 plus players, near 300 if you're the Brewers. What's important to you? So what's important to you on that preseason screen, essentially? And are you concerned with measuring that every month? And I guess, what are your concerns moving forward once you get those numbers? Because that would guide your arm care, in a sense, right?
Yes and no. I think that's one thing that seeing elsewhere where there was testing every Monday and it was 5 different tests and they were different body parts or different joints. The main idea is not how does this guy's numbers compare to that guy's, it's how does this guy's numbers compare week to week. Are these numbers changing? And if they are, is that indicating anything? Are they more fatigued? Are they making some sort of adaptation based on what we're doing, what they're doing on their training? I think it's more fair to look at those numbers week in and week out, and that's not always doable, like you said, with the numbers. But I think it's very individualized to where, again, like a guy who has GERD or whatever, like let's say his IR number is super low, we can pay attention to that. Maybe we flirt around with it and try and change it a little bit, or we try and address it. But again, did he need that? Was he benefiting from that? Has he always had that? And has it ever been a problem? We're not going to know for sure. But if his IR numbers are 20 degrees, 20 degrees, 20 degrees, you're like retesting every week, and then one week it's like 50. That's not something to where you say like, hey, slam on the brakes. We got to see what the heck's going on. It's more, okay, it's an interesting change. I wonder why it's so low today versus in the past. So it's something you pay attention to and you use as an objective measure. But again, it's not the only piece of the puzzle.
It's hard too because range of motion changes. Like it's been shown, it changes throughout the week and throughout a cycle, depending on starter versus reliever, did different topics. But like when they pitch, they're going to have changes. I did a study on this in grad school, and motion changed over. It took I think after the third day they had full range of motion. So the fourth day they had full range of motion, like full their normal range of motion. But that's going to vary per day and per test. How many times have you tested? And the guy comes, oh, I pitched yesterday. Do you still want my numbers today? Yes, because I'm supposed to do this. But it's like, I ideally would like to test you on your fourth day, third, fourth, whatever. But it's hard too, and it depends if it's uniform. So like, is that are we measuring the way research is measuring? Are we measuring flexion, ER, IR? Like, are measuring all those things the way all the research is done? Because otherwise, it's there's no correlation there. It's just it gives us a snapshot. If you want to be evidence based, I guess, but you can be evidence led. Like there's a total arc issue, and if there's a total arc issue, you don't need to measure it the same way, I guess, as as old Kevin Wilk. But yeah, I think as long as you stay consistent, have a process, I think that's something to be used for sure.
Yeah, I think the biggest indicator is previous injury. I mean, that's one of the best ways to decide if someone's at increased risk, or to see what they should be incorporating into their arm care program or whatever program it might be. So like if they have low back pain or history of low back pain, I mean, you're not gonna. I mean, you can, but maybe your first thing isn't going to be to try and increase ankle mobility. I guess that's not saying that's a bad thing, but maybe you would want to hone in on that low back. I'm not saying that ankle isn't related to back, but I would, like you said, with low-hanging fruit. The other piece, too, is just because someone's ER isn't what the norm is, and this is going back to the IR as well or whatever, but I was working with one guy to where his ER is maybe 90, and he's a pitcher, right-hand pitcher, and at first glance you'd say like, hey, that's got to be more, but then you look at how he throws, it's like straight overhand. There's not a ton of ER involved with his pitching motion. So is that really something that we need to attack? I don't know, probably not. Maybe so, but there's so much more to it than just saying, hey, we put him on a table just like everyone else and he looked like no one else. And the positions you put him in on the table, like you talked about before, since when is laying on your back and locking down your scaps into between your ribs and the table and then trying to move your arm? I'm not saying that these means of testing range of motion are wrong, but can we really say that putting them in that supine position and checking ER is the same as having them stand up and incorporate trunk rotation and full scap movement, getting into ER when they're more comfortable and properly using ER, So there's gonna be differences in what you see on the table.
It'd almost be, if at all possible, which I'm sure we could get some of our sports science people and interns to get it done, but get a side profile of everyone pitching and actually measure, on that scale where their ER is and how much IR essentially they get. And so that could quantify, hey, this guy, is a, like I watched a guy the other day throw. He Everything moved it as one, and so he probably doesn't need a lot of ER. He doesn't fold eyes. He probably doesn't need a ton of IR either. Like how much IR do we actually need in grand scheme of things? 30, 40 degrees, not even. Because then you see like guys with 30, it seems to be the lower end, 20 to 30. But yeah, it would give you a better way to judge how much is this guy getting ER. I mean, we can get to ER and get him to 120, as opposed to if he gets in the mound, maybe with all that stress and everything that's, hips turning to the left while his trunk's going right, whatever, like maybe we are getting 130, 40, a lot more. We're just afraid to test people in that range or actually risk of hurting them. Like I've stretched a guy who's had 150 ish, and I don't want to stretch him anymore. It's like I'm scared of stretching him because he's in such a, he's already, but it's his sensation of tightness. Um, and so, a grand scheme of things, I don't think me putting him there for 10 seconds, 5 seconds is really going to change anything. If it, other than just his, I feel a little better, I feel whatever, and so be it. But I'm not changing his physiological structure. It's just scary when you see a guy who has like 150 and you put him all the way to the end, and like, oh, am I hurting you? Am I hurting you? Is this good? Mm.
And you think about GTOs as well. Like, are those restricting you from taking you to a passive range versus when they're using like series elastic component and actually creating that force intrinsically with their muscle to where they can turn off any sort of restrictive barrier that they had previously. It's like me laying on a table and just having someone pull my arm back versus when I'm like, okay, my intention is to basically torque my arm back. Like there's gonna be differences there.
100%. 100%. I think that's why you get the layback with the plyo ball. It's because you're just basically desensitizing those GTOs, and yeah, if you're allowing your body, I mean, that's what all stretching is. It just decreases your ability to sense that stretch in that position. So you're allowed to get a little further. And so that's basically all it is. I mean, if you're using it, like your goal is, I want to gain ER, and then I'll work on whatever afterwards, like in range stuff, and take the ball away once I hit a certain threshold, then sure, like, but are you using the tool for the goal or the outcome that you want? Nice.
The main thing is really with all the stuff that we're talking about, it's kind of a bit frustrating that, if anyone else ends up watching this and they disagree with something we say, the interesting part is that it's so hard to kind of prove it in hard, solid proof. You know what I mean? Like we can theorize all day. Really, so much of this stuff is hard to exactly pinpoint and say you're not doing
Yeah.
that good. Like you can take one of the worst medical people in the world, and unless they're being grossly negligent, it's hard to really say what they're doing isn't right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, 100%. And I think one thing you and I have done, just even like just listening to this talk in general, like being cognizant, is so basically saying, how do I want to word this? So basically saying that, hey, it depends on this, depends on that. There's this, like, not treading too far in any direction. You know what I mean? And so not like hanging our hat, oh, I'm only this guy, or I firmly believe this. It's hard to be a firm believer in something 100% because we just don't know. So I think that's the hardest part, is like, I want to say, oh man, I'm an I's, T's, and Y's, like I do this, and you just need strength and this. How do we know? Like, how do we know that was the issue that caused it? How do you know he wasn't more stressed because he broke up with his girlfriend a week ago or whatever it might be? And that was, that could have been part of the cause, or he's been eating a lot of carbs recently and changing the pH in his body. And now that's the culprit. Like you don't know. So it's kind of, I don't want to like be safe and be like, oh, like I'm trying to prevent myself from the trolls and say, oh, I didn't really say I'm too far in which camp, but you can't, I mean, I think realistically, you just don't know. You don't know which, not one camp is right.
On the same side, though, you should commit to something, and it can't be half in, half out. When it comes to making a decision with, hey, like we think that you should be doing this, like there's value in taking a stance and committing to something while at the same time being fully able to pull back and and reevaluate, go back to the drawing board. Like, I think the dangers are when you either are too indecisive and you just don't really believe in anything you're doing. You think what you're doing is wrong or whatever, like you can't make a decision, versus on the other side of it where you go so far in and you say, no, this is totally like he's PEC and that's what his problem and that's what he needs to fix. Like I'm hard nosed on that and that's his problem and that's his solution, to where like you have the blinders on and you're not even paying attention to something else that's staring you in the face. So it kind of goes without saying, but it's always a good reminder to think about it that way.
I agree. I think that's why it's having a like your own personal model that whatever you believe in, like whatever has worked for you, like you're going to get results if you go with one model essentially. But then how do you tweak it? What's worked for you? How do you minimize your downside? What's changing? And constantly evaluating yourself, but the way you treat and the way you interact and the way you get changes with people. And so I would say, like whether you're like I'm all in PRI, great. Like it's a great lens, it's a great model. It's not always 100% right. And so like where's, maybe you make it better and you find certain ways or certain, exercises to get the same result, but a different way. And so that's, I think just having a model should be consistent, but then you can kind of jump in and out of different camps and use things as tools where you see fit.
So how did you develop your model? I mean, it's obviously not totally and permanently developed. It's probably going to change year to year even, but how did you get comfortable with whatever your methods are?
So I still don't feel comfortable. I think I've gotten better from where I was at, just in growth terms, but overall there's still so much I'm just unsure of. And is this the best route? Is this, but basically taking things that resonate with you and that you believe. And so whether it was first, for me, I'd say I didn't really have a model in undergrad. Grad school, I got a little more like FMS based because we took the course then and started reading into that more and trying to incorporate that. Like I tried it a lot. My first year in GCL, I was like, what was this guy's FMS? What are we doing? And realizing that they were just measurements taken just to take measurements. But then it evolved and I got introduced into, our PRI stuff and it's like, oh man, this is pretty cool. And so I had more success with that and I did FMS, so I could start going with that. And then the course that I took this past off season, I was like, okay, I feel like this is even further down this rabbit hole. And so I changed my beliefs. Like there's still things I'll go, like if I use both models essentially, but so I'm still trying to work on mine. And I think that's where it comes down to like drawing out your model, like physically drawing it out on a piece of paper and trying like, what are my steps or what are things I'm concerned about in all grand scheme of things. And I think that's what makes something like a truth or like a law is it doesn't matter what circumstance you're in, it's always true. And so I think if you can keep asking that question where I can use this one model and every person I see will fit into this model. And if that's accurate, then I think you're getting closer. And if you're not actively doing that, then I'd say you're staying stagnant.
It always goes back to reevaluating your own system, right?
True that.
Anything, I guess, in the past 24 hours when we scheduled this, anything that kind of ran through your mind, doesn't even have to be related to arm care, but anything that's been going through your brain?
I'm going to take the I&I on Zoom end of August. That's something that I think I'm gonna book, like 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. AZ time.
Do you have pre-formulated questions that you're going to try and, or is it not interactive?
I don't know what to expect, but I'm assuming it's interactive. About 70 people on a Zoom. So I have questions. I don't necessarily have questions yet. I'm going back to my notebooks to see if I had anything written down, any of the other courses, and then kind of taking like a self-reflection of what do I want to gain out of this course, and some issues I have maybe with people right now that I can't get changes on, or I see this a lot. Why is this so? I think really just going with that first. But yeah, I think other than that, man, that's about it. I'm reading a book on happiness now. Not really happiness, but like success and like what it's called barking up the wrong tree. But basically some counterintuitive ways to be successful, and talks about like how people are successful and why people are successful, and I think it's pretty cool.
Who recommended that to you?
No one. I went to the bookstore here on Camelback, and I just perused, and there's one actually a really cool section. So I just grabbed like 4 or 5 books. I wasn't planning on getting any, but it always happens. I always have like 5 or 6 like on queue, and it goes from like, oh, I need this one too, and so I grabbed like 4 or 5 more. And so I think I've went down my Buddhist rabbit hole a little bit, and so now I'm going to jump back out and get into some success or leadership, or I should probably just start reading clinical stuff, but I don't know. We'll see.
So much Buddha that you started to develop the belly.
Well, the problem is there's suffering in everything, and so I chose not to suffer. I'm gonna cease my suffering now.
I was suffering waiting for you to finish your pizza before we could hop on this call.
I've been suffering this whole time. I'm also impressed we didn't make a lot of jokes in between.
That was all business, huh? Here, I'll end recording and maybe we can wrap up